Welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. We started out early this morning with a rant on the Bible and government. I went into a deep dive into the Constitution, talking about the Bible and government, that God instituted fundamental principles within government that God established. He actually requires that we acknowledge his sovereignty. He actually requires that we acknowledge that he's the one that designed and truly inspired the Founding Fathers to establish our Constitution based on a summation of principles that were being preached in the pulpits around the 13 colonies. And the foundation was that we were granted certain inalienable rights, 3 of which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We've now escalated and elevated pursuit of happiness to be the top right of an American. Life has been removed by Roe v. Wade in 1973, and we've really have been operating on a broken moral compass for quite a long time. Our guest in this edition of Revealing the Truth is Jenna Ellis, who is the author of The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution, a guide for Christians to understand America's constitutional crisis. Jenna Ellis, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you, Rabbi, for having me. It's a privilege to be with you today.
Thank you so much. Let me introduce our audience to you because you have quite a resume. Jenna Ellis is an attorney, professor of law, and international speaker. She specializes and teaches constitutional law. She also specializes in criminal defense practice and is a former deputy district attorney. She's licensed in federal practice, has appeared in litigation on behalf of the United States Department of State and the Department of Navy. She's a professor at Colorado Christian University and the College of Adult and Graduate Studies, and an on-air legal analyst for Moody Bible Institute Radio. She's also a leader and teaching assistant with the Denver Institute for Faith in Work in Colorado. She has a BA in technical journalism and is a fellow of the World Journalism Institute in New York. Prior to practicing law, she regularly published in a variety of local and national forums, including the Associated Press. She's also been published in the Colorado Lawyer. She regularly speaks at international and local conferences, university and churches on a variety of legal, constitutional, and current event issues, including assisting the Colorado Attorney General drafting a presentation to a panel of foreign judges on America hate crime law. Her most requested presentations include U.S. constitutional law and the Bible, and reclaiming the biblical definition of marriage, which are available through her website. Jenna received her Juris Doctor from the University of Richmond School of Law. She writes that America is in the midst of a cultural and constitutional law crisis that began more than 60 years ago and was further exacerbated by the 2015 Supreme Court same-sex marriage decision. How did we become a culture that lacks objective morality and embraces secular ideas, hinging on the majority whim of 9 justices? Jenna Ellis, let me ask you that question. How did we become a nation whose moral compass is broken and who is left to the interpretation of I can say it no better than this, than the ruling party?
Right, and that really is the question. And in order to understand how we got to this situation and this crisis in America, we have to go back and ask ourselves the question, where did our law come from? What do we as Christians understand as the origin of law? If we believe that all law that's legitimate hinges on man's whim and whoever is the sovereign, whether that was the king or whether it's our current Supreme Court, it's our current president, our former president, then laws are completely subjective. And they're completely at whim of redefinition to whoever is in power. And we saw, especially over the weekend with the Women's March, that's what they fear, is that the new sovereign, the new president, is going to, at whim, change the definition of their rights. But Christians understand something different, and the founders understood something different. They acknowledged in the Declaration that truth is self-evident. Yes. It is a part of our reality, and it's imposed by God on reality. And that reality and that truth tells us that our rights come from God. They're unalienable, meaning God endowed them on us as human beings made in the image of God, and the only proper role of government is to preserve and protect those rights. So any interpretation of the Constitution, very simply, must be consistent with biblical truth. And my book sets out exactly how we can show that and prove that through our founding documents. Where we got astray is believing that our rights come from government. How often do you hear someone express it as my First Amendment right to free speech? That's not exactly accurate. It's my unalienable right given by God to free exercise of religion, to freedom of speech, that is preserved and protected through the Constitution. So that fundamental shift is what happened in American culture that got us so far off track to where we are today.
Well, you are exactly right. Excuse me. We've become a nation that wants to give not what the Constitution gave us, which was a majority rule of the people, by the people, and for the people, which means that the larger good is served when the largest percentage of the population. I actually use, and I took this from a friend, the parable of the brownies. That the United States is like a tray of brownies. That, I don't know if you're like me, but when I want a brownie, I want the center one. I want the one right there in the middle. In order to protect the sweet one in the middle, there has to be a hard, crusty outer edge that's right there against the flame that gets burnt, that sacrifices itself for its far right and its far left causes. And they're the ones that are on the fringe. And they may represent 10% on the left and 10% on the right. But right there down the middle, that 80% of that tray of brownies is sweet and moist and juicy, and that's where the real flavor is. Now, I know people that like the crust. I know the people that like the hard, burnt edges. But our nation is protected by a Bill of Rights that gives us the right to protest, the right to freedom of speech. And that is that edge. That's what we saw on Saturday in that march, was this edge that takes that heat of the fire that protects you and I, who are that sweet center in the middle that believes in a constitutional mandate for a moral law that lines up with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in a balance, that there is a balance in there, that God does not like a false balance, and that when we are swayed by the influences of man as opposed to God, we become little gods. We then are in competition with the sovereign one.
Right. And to have and achieve that balance, which essentially means the balance is whatever is true. Whatever is the truth of God as He, for His own sovereign purposes, has imposed upon reality, that dictates what our rights are and how the government can best preserve and protect them and not infringe upon them. And so whether or not 1% of people, whether I'm the only person in the universe that believes that, or whether 100% of people believe that, it doesn't turn on whether you or I believe truth. It turns on objective, absolute truth. And so this whole idea of a moral majority is actually false within the true structure of our Constitution. Our founders understood, and all of them assented in the Declaration, that worldview statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their creator, not their government, right, with certain unalienable rights. And they went on to say that the only proper role of government is to preserve and protect those truths. So it doesn't matter really whether I believe it, whether you believe it, whether a majority or not believes it, but rather our constitutional structure is necessarily predicated on this fundamental assertion and assent to truth. And so by definition, any interpretation of our Constitution has to be consistent with biblical truth. Our Bill of Rights is not expressing what our rights are as given by government. It's simply saying these rights are so fundamental and we get them from our Creator that we are going to take an added measure and we are going to enumerate them. And I prefer to call it a Bill of Protections,
Yes.
Because it's not a Bill of Rights. It's saying, and the very first sentence in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law. It's saying, Congress, just in case you didn't understand your very limited ability in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which those are the only subject matter, the only areas that Congress can legitimately legislate, only those areas. Just in case you didn't get that, Congress, we are going to take an added measure and say you also cannot legislate on these particular rights that the founders knew were most easily abridged and infringed by an over-assertive and dominant government, and that would step out of their role. And so historically, Hamilton and Madison disagree on whether or not we should have a Bill of Rights. Hamilton, and I agree with his assertion, that a Bill of Rights can be dangerous because maybe 240 years later, like what we're seeing today, then our government would say, look, because it's textually in the Bill of Rights, we can then say that our rights come from government, and government can start to regulate it. He was very concerned about that possibility, which we've seen evidence today. We have to understand the proper role of the Constitution and where the Constitution gets its authority from, and where is the standard that we define our rights before we can accurately and properly interpret the Constitution as a protection.
You know, I see the Bill of Rights from a biblical perspective of adding to the law, which God clearly states, do not add to or take away anything from my laws and my decrees. So this concept that we can add to based on the leading power, based on the majority, based on the way Congress is set up, based on the party rule system, tends to erode the moral basis of the Constitution to become what suits the interest of private industry, private ventures, supporters, donors, and in this case, the expansion of women's rights, and certainly equality is paramount. There should have been equality all the time. It should not have been something, because it says all men are created equal, and all men, and that includes men and women. But then to go to a woman's body as her own denies creation. It denies that the power of God, who is the only one who can create, and that he knew you before you were in your mother's womb. And so we look at this and we deny the power of God through legislation of something like Roe v. Wade that leans towards the vocal. And 1973, you had Dan Rather, you had what was his name? I know the son, but Wallace, Mike Wallace.
Mike Wallace, and
Right.
now his son, Chris
Right.
Wallace.
You know, Cronkite and people like that going back into that day. And then you had newspapers. And I graduated college in 1973, so I'm very familiar with this. The statement that was made by my parents, I heard them say this. If it was in the newspaper and it was on the news, it has to be true because they wouldn't publish something that was false. So this move towards legalizing abortion became something that was a right.
Yes, and the liberals are using right, or that term, in a very different context than what the Declaration actually shows. And I agree with you that we as a civil government, and even a church government and a family government, the three spheres of government that God ordained and established in his truth and reality, we cannot add to the moral law of God. Where we can legislate is consistent with that truth. And certainly we are in a different form of government in a constitutional republic than the Old Testament under the Mosaic Law and some of those other covenants or different types of legal systems. And so where the government can legislate is in accordance with truth and with morality. And that is the definition of a legitimate law, is that it comports with and is consistent with a valid, rightful, and appropriate authority. And the Declaration recognized, and the lawyers who are our founders who drafted that, I love that they used the language and the terminology for God at the end of the Declaration, saying we appeal to the supreme judge of the universe. They understood he is the ultimate sovereign. He is the ultimate arbiter of what is and is not truth. And so by basing our system of government on that truth, then when we legislate, then we have to do that consistent with biblical truth and morality. And so often I get the question as a constitutional attorney, well, is that okay to legislate morality? I don't think we should impose our beliefs on anyone else. Isn't that against the First Amendment? Well, no, all laws legislate someone's morality.
Yes.
A criminal law that says you, American citizen, cannot do this particular act, that's a statement of the morality of a society. And so all laws are inherently legislating morality. It's just whose morality are we legislating? Going back to that question of origin. Are we legislating the whim of the current government? Or are we legislating in accordance with objective universal truth? And that has to become the question. And we are so privileged to live in an American society that was founded upon recognition and assent to those principles of liberty.
Well, you're exactly right. As a matter of fact, founding father and educator Noah Webster said the moral principles and precepts contained in the scriptures ought to form the basis of all our civil constitutions and law. All the miseries and evils which men suffer from vice, crime, ambition, injustice, oppression, slavery, and war proceed from their despising or neglecting the precepts contained in the Bible.
Yes, and that's exactly what the founders recognized, is that civil government is a necessary evil, because we know that man is fallen, man is sinful. We need a civil government to restrain sinners. And that is a legitimate use. If you look at Romans 13, if you look at, and I love Romans, the whole scope, written by Paul, who of course was a lawyer, and understanding why civil government is necessary. We also know why the church government and why the family government is also necessary. But the founders understood that all three of these had to interact together and have a balance of, going back to that balance, that tension point of saying, we aren't over-regulating, we aren't restricting too much, but we also aren't, like in the libertarian viewpoint, we aren't giving so much freedom to sinners that ultimately the government isn't doing its job.
Well, you're exactly right. You know, in my opening commentary this morning, I talked about the Black Robe Regiment. I talked about the key influencers of our society at the time of the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, that it was keenly influenced by the ministers, by the pastors who were preaching the gospel message, preaching the Word of God, and that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are actually a summation of their sermons. These were principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, taxation without representation, tyranny, the issues that we face in a corrupt government where absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we see that. We see that in the world as we look at those who try to emulate a republic with free election, Germany being one, but endless terms, Israel being a hybrid, if you will, of almost a parliamentary with a representation of coalition forming, but he's in his fourth term. It's not since FDR when we imposed term limits that we began to realize that these dynasties were being formed and that power was being hoarded. This idea of draining the swamp is just such a perfect picture, because there are career politicians. It was never intended for anyone to be a career politician.
Right. And so this is where the founders had such a brilliant idea. And you're absolutely right that they were influenced by the total truth of reality. They weren't influenced only by one particular political ideology,
right,
any more than any individual person is only influenced by either science or religion or political ideology. We all have a composite of what creates that 3D image of our understanding and discovery of truth. And the founders were no different. And so they didn't separate the truth of God and religion from the truth of the best political system. What they formed, and what's amazing about our constitutional republic, is that they all agreed and assented to our Creator and to the truth of God. Then they simply asked the question, and like lawyers do, they argued about it. What is the best way to preserve and protect the rights that we have that come from God? And ultimately, they generated a constitutional republic with a separation of powers, with this understanding of federalism, that you have a very limited federal government. You give the power back to the people in the states for self-governance, for freedom and liberty that are actually ideals that only come from the truth of God. You can't have it any other way, as the women on Saturday are discovering. If you put a man in charge, whether it's 9 humans on the Supreme Court, whether it's one king, whether it's a multitude in Parliament or Congress, men are fallible and sinners and will fail. And the founders all understood that. So they said, we're not suggesting we're getting this perfectly right, but what we're going to do is allow the most limited government in order to best preserve and protect the freedom and liberty that comes from God. And that's a wonderful system that has never before been tried in the history of civilization. And that's why our American experiment is so wonderful and is so precious. But we have to understand, and what my book suggests, is how we can better educate ourselves on how to advocate for that truth without having to have that divide of, first we have to claim that the founders are Orthodox, evangelical Christians, or they believe in the tenets of Scripture, or any of those things that are just religious-based, or claim them as constitutional patriots. We tend to divide the founders into those two categories, where really it doesn't matter who they were as much as it matters what they set down in our legal documents. And we can go to those documents and absolutely prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the founders believed in absolute truth and that they predicated our system of government on that truth.
No question. Absolutely no question. You're listening to Jenna Ellis, and I would say wax eloquently about her passion for the legal basis for a moral constitution, a guide for Christians to understand America's constitutional crisis. The power to the state, I really think, began to erode when we created a Department of Education. That was one of the real turning points to when we federalized this idea of a Department of Education. It's a modern institution.
It is, and we've seen the erosion of these principles only over the last 50 or 60 years as we've increased the powers to the federal government unconstitutionally. Because again, and if the viewers go and actually read the Constitution for yourself, it's only 5 pages.
Right.
Very, very limited powers are given to the federal government. We know that Congress is the only branch that can actually legislate or create laws, and they can only do that on those very specific limited subjects that are in Article 1, Section 8. Guess what's not in there? Education, any domestic relations issues,
right,
anything about women's rights in terms of contraception, in terms of, all of the same-sex marriage decisions, all of these things that have become social issues that the Supreme Court is now falsely asserting that they have power to create law, which they don't. That's given to Congress. But they also don't have power to interpret anything based on subject matter that the federal government can't even look at. That is, by definition, reserved to the states through the 9th and 10th Amendment. And we got so far off track when we as states yielded our power to the federal government, and we have to return that power to the states and to the people.
Well, that's exactly the justification for these potential 3 or 4 Supreme Court justices that under the Trump administration that we're going to see appointed, and we're going to see a move towards a more constitutionally balanced Supreme Court that is not going to interpret but look at the pure letter of the law, not the intent as interpreted by society as society has evolved into a society which is morally bankrupt, a society that's morally corrupt. And you cannot look at it through the lens of society. You must look at it through the lens of the written word, the clear meaning. And it is very much the same way as the Bible. I'm a clear meaning preacher. When I look at the Hebrew, and I look at the idiomatic Hebrew, and I can look at the expressions in the Bible of what the actual words were, not the translation into English, but the Hebrew of the Old Testament, and looking at the New Testament through the lens of the idiomatic Hebrew life, the Jewish life in times of Jesus, and the writings that refer to that. I don't have to interpret. God does a great job himself of interpreting his own word. The Constitution is a document which is sealed. It is not to be added to or taken away from. It is an absolute. It was the foundation. If you pull the foundation stone out, the cornerstone, the capstone, the foundation stone, it all collapses. It becomes a house of cards. And so we're talking to Jenna Ellis. As my audience knows from the years that I spent discussing this with Michael Hart on the Michael Hart Show, Michael will be back with us on Friday morning, another reunion of the two of us that did so many years together, talking about the Constitution, talking about the moral compass, talking about the headlines and where our country has moved and what we've lived through in our own lifetimes, that we've seen this shift, this dramatic shift. And it's been in my lifetime, 65 years. It became the turning point. It was when Eisenhower invited the Muslim Brotherhood into the White House. I can mark a point when we began to, a great president, a great general, but yet looking at the issues of the Middle East, looking at the Muslim Brotherhood that have been around since 1928 and what influence energy had on decisions, on our interests. I look at the fall of Shah of Iran. I look at the Carter administration and Burt Lance in the Office of Management and Budget. And what is the Office of Management and Budget? And why does the federal government have trillions of dollars in debt, saying that they're supporting the states? The states have their own system, their own support system. There is a federal highway system, and we've established that of interstate commerce. But we've created so many new areas within government that this mandate that was signed yesterday of a hiring freeze and a planned purposeful reduction of non-military personnel to cut the cost of government, one would say, well, he's supporting unemployment of government employees. And I would say that's correct. Their skills are transferable to the private sector. People need accountants, they need auditors, they need these kind of heavy oversight within corporations for standard accounting practices, for whatever they have. But you embrace and you tackle in here what really is a compelling case. It is factual. It addresses things that if you want to know where we went astray, this is an absolute book for you. When we go to break, I want to encourage you. Go to the Books and Media page of the website. It won't take you off the program. It'll open up a new page for you, and you can stay tuned in. And order Jenna Ellis, Esquire, The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution, a guide for Christians to understand America's constitutional crisis. And we are right in the throes of that constitutional crisis right now with 8 Supreme Court justices, a new president, a new appointment, and that new appointment will create a domino effect for some of those current Supreme Court justices to retire, thereby opening up the door for an additional move towards a constitutional, moral constitution based on biblical principles, according to God's Word and according to the Founding Fathers, and as illustrated, a very solid argument for the legal basis for a moral constitution. We'll come back to Jenna when we return from these announcements. Welcome back to Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're in a dynamic discussion with Jenna Ellis, author of The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution, a guide for Christians to understand America's constitutional crisis. I want to open up this last segment with Jenna with an excerpt from her book from Chapter 6, The Declaration of Independence. She writes, "The Declaration of Independence is the legal document that effectively created the independent political sovereignty of the United States colonies. The Declaration of Independence was not simply a public relations statement, a personal letter from the founders to the King of England, or any other type of written document that did not inherently mandate a legal effect. The Declaration of Independence, like a legal document in today's courts, has a practical, significant legal effect. In order to accomplish this mandate, it systematically drew from divine law authority to state a legal cause of action, list of grievances against the English government for ceasing to function in the legitimate royal government, legal justification for separation, and its intrinsic legitimacy, independence, and sovereignty." Welcome back to the program, Jen Ellis.
Thank you so much for having me.
A bold but very true statement that everything in the Constitution gets its authority from the authority,
Yes.
the absolute authority, the maker of heaven and earth. And that nothing within the Constitution in any way is in opposition to God's law. It actually is a practical application of God's fundamental laws.
Yes, and if we trace back our founding documents and what the founders created to be our system of government, then we see that our Constitution is only 5 pages. That can't possibly contain, and it actually doesn't contain or enumerate, meaning put down in the actual text, every single unalienable right that American citizens and all human beings have. What the founders did was say, this government system is built upon God's truth, and truth is objective. Truth does not change. We know that God himself does not change. And so even though the founders could have established a variety of different systems of government, what they purposed to do and what they actually accomplished, if we were consistent with the Constitution, is a system designed to best preserve our life and liberty and all of the unalienable rights endowed by God himself. That is the beauty of the American system, and that's exactly why the founders created a constitutional republic. So we have to understand the Constitution in context. In my book, I draw a pyramid that I call the founding documents hierarchy.
Yes.
And that shows in a word picture what our Constitution is founded upon. And what the progressive agenda has attempted to do is undercut the Constitution, remove it from its roots, and say we are going to interpret this in a vacuum. We are going to, as you alluded to Scripture before the break, what unfortunately, so many pastors do is take one word or phrase out of Scripture and they build a whole doctrine around it.
Right.
And they are actually asserting their own ideas and interpretation rather than reading Scripture plainly for its authorial meaning and in context. In the same way, our Supreme Court has excised different words and phrases in the Constitution and has built entire doctrines around it. We no longer refer to the free exercise of religion by citing the entire text of the First Amendment, by showing where that idea originates from, how that relates to our unalienable rights. All we do is refer to the free exercise clause and whatever the Supreme Court has said that it means.
Right.
That's not the most effective advocacy on behalf of the Constitution and on behalf of our own rights and our liberties that God himself has given us.
So to the person that would argue that the Constitution, as drafted by the Founding Fathers, was drafted 240 years ago, what most people don't realize is people of my age have lived for over 25% of America's history. We're a very young nation. This document was established at that time to be a non-modifiable absolute. It was to be the rule of law. for the land. And to say that it is not contemporary because it's 240 years old is to say that the Bible is not contemporary because it was given to Moses 4,000 years ago.
Right. And what the founders understood, though, is where Scripture has a divine inspiration and is a closed canon, the founders recognized that the Constitution, while absolutely the law of the land, and they made no provision whatsoever to overhaul the Constitution or rewrite it or call another constitutional convention, the Constitution is fixed. What they did provide for is in Article 5, which is the ability to amend the Constitution, but
right.
only in furtherance of that essential mandate from the Declaration. That if, for some reason, the designation and the distribution of powers to the federal government becomes irresponsible, or there's something like, for example, women's right to vote, that wasn't textually set down, but we now have the 19th Amendment. That is consistent with truth. That's consistent with the Declaration's mandate. So Article 5 in the Constitution does provide a way we can amend or supplement the Constitution and get our federal government back on track. And it also provides that if the federal government usurps any of their power, like we've seen them do in the last 50 and 60 years, then either Congress or 2/3 of the states can call for amendments to be written to take away certain powers from the federal government, return it to the states, give it to a different branch. Like, for example, we could take the nomination power of Supreme Court justices away from the executive. We could give that to Congress. We could give that to the states. That would not be antithetical to the original interpretation of the Constitution in Article 5. But what would be antithetical to the Constitution is if we provided the ability for the federal government to do anything inconsistent with biblical truth and inconsistent with this fundamental understanding that our rights come from God and not from government. So that's where we me as a constitutional lawyer, believe in this understanding and this articulation of what we call the doctrine of originalism. Mm-hmm. It means that we understand the Constitution has a fixed, identifiable purpose, meaning, and scope. That cannot change. And none of the founders disagreed with the assertion in the Declaration that truth is, it's discoverable, and our rights come from God. All they disagreed with was how best to preserve and protect that. We, 240 years later, can disagree whether the government is doing its job. We can change the structure of the federal government, but what we cannot do is allow the federal government to be the givers of our rights or the arbiters of our rights. That is absolutely fixed by the Declaration and fixed by the American experiment and principles of liberty. That part of the Constitution and the Declaration absolutely cannot change.
Completely agree. As I look at Article 5, and maybe just like in law school, you weren't required to read the Constitution.
Right. And, it's one of those things, as people ask me, how did we get so far off track and why aren't other lawyers expressing this? I mean, we should be able to have any lawyer who's passed the bar exam be able to read a simple 5-page document that's the highest law of the land and interpret it accordingly. That shouldn't be left to these Ivy League activist judges. But what happens in law school, and even in my own law school, what happens in constitutional law class is that we don't even have to read the Declaration or the Constitution. All we had to do was read the Supreme Court opinions. And what that's teaching all future lawyers is that necessarily the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution accurately. And so we have to navigate our system of government and our interpretation of the Constitution based on what the Supreme Court has said, and we're not allowed to question that. That becomes entirely problematic when we look at, for example, Roe v. Wade or the 2015 Obergefell decision. Those were absolutely unconstitutional decisions. But in the scope of how lawyers are taught, we are taught to say the Supreme Court said it, they're infallible because they are final. And so that's the final word. So we have to, as a nation, not just lawyers, and my book is not written to lawyers. It is written to every American who wants to understand fundamentally what is the problem and how do we fix it. As a good lawyer, I don't just assert the problem. I tell you how we can fix it. And to actually be able to articulately and confidently advocate for biblical truth and the true interpretation of the Constitution. We have to start there.
You know, this is exactly why the appointing of Supreme Court justices by a party-friendly or a confirmation body that is skewed to one side or the other side truly advances the cause of a liberal agenda or a conservative agenda as and really drives the way the influence is to interpret it that way.
Right. And we're seeing that in the progressive idea of constitutional law. We're seeing that rather than being fixed objective law, because again, we know truth cannot change, we're seeing that law and its legitimacy changes, and it's fluid in our society based on whomever is in power. And that's the crux of the problem. Our Constitution is not based on who interprets it best or who interprets it the most recently. It's not a question of the time or the era of or who is in power. It's the question of what is reality, what is eternal truth. And this is where Christians have to become involved. Apologetics and advocating on behalf of our faith is absolutely important. And we have to take that importance and that apologetic and apply it to our constitutional structure and to our government and be able to advocate effectively for the legitimacy of our law.
No question. No question whatsoever. We're talking to Jenna Ellis, author of The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution. This is, as she says, a lawyer not writing to other lawyers, but writing to believers to equip, to educate, to inform. I don't think that there is a single other resource written from a biblical worldview that I could recommend more strongly than I would recommend this book. It's a compelling case for the true roots of America's founding documents and objective morality and how our system of government is founded upon the Christian worldview and God's unchanging law, not a secular humanist worldview. And what we see in this secular humanist worldview is an embracing of state-sponsored enemies of America. How did we get to the point where we began funding, endorsing state-sponsored terrorism? That is exactly what we gained independence from, because we said that England was state-sponsored terrorism, that they were imposing their will and taking human life because we would not submit, and it was tyranny.
Right. Well, once we come off of this fixed rooting in absolute truth, and we assert wrongfully and unconstitutionally that truth is flexible and it's a small t, as Francis Schaeffer always called truth with a capital T. It is
Right.
fixed, it's objective. If we as a society embrace the false notion that we can define truth however we want, that opens it up to literally anything becoming law. And we saw that in Hitler's Nazi Germany. We've seen that in a variety of different other societies that are based on man's whim, that their term of legitimate law is only based on, does the final civil authority say it's right? Then it's right. They have no fixed objective standard by which they can say, okay, something is either truth or it's non-truth. That's what the founders established, is to say, to preserve and protect our rights, our standard is not what they believed. They didn't hold themselves out to be the standard of perfect orthodoxy. They said truth of God, capital T, truth, is our standard, because truth is self-evident. It comes from our Creator. That's the standard. and they built a system of government that supported that. And so when we look at our Constitution and we look at its interpretation, we have a standard. But we get so far off of that when we remove that measuring mechanism and we say the only standard is who happens to be on the Supreme Court. And that's how we've gotten so far off. And that's why the progressives celebrated the same-sex marriage decision, the Roe v. Wade decision, the contraceptive decisions in the 60s. And that's why they are so scared that Trump will nominate Supreme Court justices, a President Trump's administration, that actually adhere to the original interpretation of the Constitution, because they know they won't get their progressive agenda passed if truth is our standard.
So when you look at Article 3, the establishment of the Supreme Court, and what cases they should try, it does not state that they should try cases on interpretation of the Constitution.
Well, and so what happened is that one of the very first cases that came before the Supreme Court, and again, Article 3 establishes that we should have one Supreme Court. It doesn't say how many justices we're required to have. The court wasn't always 9 justices. It doesn't have to continue to be 9 justices.
Right.
Through Article 5, we could expand the court. That would be constitutional. But what it does say is there is a final arbiter of whether or not a law passed by Congress or an action of the executive branch is constitutional. But what happened in 1803 was a case called Marbury v. Madison. And what that case did is established this concept of judicial review. It basically established this premise that the Supreme Court can interpret any law, and including state law, and it can render an opinion that then is binding on the rest of the country. So the concept of judicial review, the idea that the Supreme Court as a judicial branch can review congressional and executive action, that part is correct. But where Marbury got off track, and this was only maybe 20 years after the Constitution was ratified, was that they allowed the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did it itself. It took more authority than was given in Article 3 and said our interpretation is not only going to be final, but it's going to be binding on all of the states. And that's where we've significantly gotten off track in the last, again, 50 or 60 years, because the court has now taken that improper decision and a floodgate has opened to say we are now going to interpret not just the subject matters that the Constitution allows us, but we're going to interpret literally anything that we want to.
So they decided on legislating a new law and a new set of regulations for themselves, which expanded their power beyond what was defined in the Constitution.
Right. And initially, they were fairly judicious, for lack of a better word, with that. And they still rendered opinions that were within the scope of their authority. But what Marbury v. Madison set up was that future Supreme Courts, like in the 1950s and beyond, could use that decision and they could assume power that's not actually given in the scope of Article 3.
And we're seeing the ramifications of that today. We're seeing
Absolutely.
it in the fact that this concept of the people, by the people, and for the people has become of the minority interest, for the minority interest, for the protection of the minority interest, that I'm now, in some states, I would be convicted of a hate crime.
Right. And
because of my freedom of speech on this network,
right.
to stand against Islamic terrorism or to stand against the legislation of morality from legislating homosexuality.
Right, which is absolutely ridiculous. And what the progressives try to do, again, is to excise certain words from the Constitution, relegate the Declaration to a historical document that doesn't have any legal relevance. And they use that term, we the people, to try to say that this is a social contract, that whatever man says and assents to in the majority, then that's fine, that's what goes. But who are we the people? We are the very same people that the Declaration recognized are endowed by their creator with those unalienable rights. We are not people who are free to ratify any law and make it legitimate, even if it goes against the truth of God. So we can't let the progressives redefine all of these terms that are very plain when you look at the context of our founding documents. And I go through each of these documents very intently and almost line by line, and certainly paragraph by paragraph in the book, to show you what the plain meaning is and how we can advocate for truth.
Jenna, this has been a wonderful time spent with you. We could go on for hours and hours. We could do a whole 4-hour special on this, but our time is actually coming to an end. We've been talking with Jenna Ellis, the author of The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution. Jenna, how can we get a hold of you? Where's your website and how can we reach you?
Yes, I am at Colorado Christian University, so you can reach me through ccu.edu,
Okay.
or you can also reach me through my website, which is simply my name, jennaellis.org. And you can certainly follow me on social media, Facebook or Twitter as well.
Wonderful. I encourage all of you to get the book, The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution. Jenna Ellis, what a treasure you are. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you for having me. It's been a privilege.
Thank you so much. Well, that concludes our broadcasting day here at the Igniting Nation Broadcasting Network. It comes to an end of a day for Revealing the Truth. But join us tomorrow when we will bring a new set of guests to you, a new commentary, a new Rabbi's Rant. Make sure to follow us on Facebook at Igniting a Nation and Twitter at Igniting a Nation. Keep up with us on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, through our website, ignitinganation.com or inb.com. Until we see you right back here tomorrow, we wish you shalom.